I'm Nick Hernandez. Thank you so much for listening to the Positivity Matters podcast. On this show, we have conversations with scholars, organization leaders, community builders, and focus around well-being, positive psychology, mental health, and human flourishing. Today, I have Cormac Russell as a guest on the show. He's the Director of Nurture Development and a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at Northwestern University. He's trained communities, agencies, NGOs, and governments in asset-based community development and other strengths-based approaches in Kenya, Southern Sudan, South Africa, the UK, Canada, Australia, and many more places. Cormac, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Looking forward to our conversation together.
So recently, I stumbled across your book, The Connected Community, and this for me was a very profound intersection between well-being research and positive psychology and asset-based community development. For myself, I had a interest that I don't exactly know where it came from with regard to community building. I had a high school principal who lived it and walked through the rest of high school, college, a little bit of graduate school, into the workforce, into a community building workshop here in Lincoln, Nebraska, where the appreciative inquiry approach was used as a backbone for that. And around the same time, I learned about the Strengths Finder from Gallup, and that really sort of made me aware of positive psychology as a thing. This was around 2006. And one of the first things that I did was to look at the Positive Psychology Center's website at the University of Pennsylvania. And I saw an aspiration there that said that they were trying to make interventions to elevate the well-being of individuals, organizations, and communities. And when I saw that word community as a possible intersection point for this, it felt like something just clicked into place for what I wanted to be involved with for the rest of my life. And so anytime I've seen someone that's working at that intersection, like bells and whistles go off in my mind about how awesome that is. So I
That's
guess,
wonderful.
yeah. So I've just been experimenting at that intersection since really around that time. And so it's just great to have you on the show with and knowing that you have that interest in both worlds. So maybe tell
Yeah,
us a little bit about that story of how you came to have both of those interests and how they
yeah,
intersect.
sure. Happy to. I resonate with what you've just shared there, Nick. I think similarly, my own life trajectory is aligned, so we're fellow travelers. And my sense is the reason that we have pores in our skin is because we don't just grow from inside our skin. We are by nature social beings. So these kinds of fault lines between business and self and community, I think, they're just artificial constructs. And most of how we move and experience our lives are largely at points of intersection and intersectionality between many of these and much more besides. So, not surprisingly, much of what I certainly experience in my own life is autobiographical, but it's also political and it's social. So, growing up in the west of Ireland, which was my life trajectory, my accident of birth, um, was just very much a rural experience, not a rural idol or anything like that, but very much an experience of the value of the village, of the community. There was a interdependence. We really were reliant a lot on our neighbors for gathering hay or whatever it might be, but just even for social connection. And so that wasn't a questioned thing. It was just that was my childhood. I grew up, I trained as a psychologist. I worked in the Irish health system, particularly with kids who had been brought into care, often because of quite complex family circumstances. And in the early 90s, it really struck me that these kids had been taken away from their communities and families and put into institutions, albeit at that time the institutions were houses in neighborhoods. They really were not in the middle of a neighborhood. I suppose they were in a sense, they were in a neighborhood, but they were not of a community. And it really struck me that that was a way that in Ireland we had organized an awful lot of how we think about people's well-being if they're vulnerable, if they have challenges or they're feeling overwhelmed with mental health or safety or whatever it might be, from our old to our young to our homeless. We tend to segregate them, push them to the edge, and then surround them with professional interventions. And I was very struck because of my own upbringing at the absence of community and the devaluing of that. So it felt like what I was hearing, or the implication of what I was seeing in these models, was that the institutional world held all of the best solutions to a good life for these kids. And I just didn't buy it, quite frankly. It just did not resonate with my lived experience. And while I had been trained to see things a certain way, I couldn't, you could take the boy out of the country, but you couldn't take the country out of the boy, even if you trained him in psychology. It still seemed to me that, organic sociologist or anthropologist was still there asking questions that irritated my bosses, like, well, why are these kids not connected into their community? And if we're taking them out of one community, why would we not try to build bridges? In any case, I left after many years of arguing the case, and I began the journey of actually trying to understand better how our systems could begin to feature and honor community rather than always creating an institutional alternative or a medical alternative to what I saw as a community possibility. So that's very much what brought me into the orbit of the asset-based community development world, that kind of early disaffection or dissatisfaction with the idea that institutions hold a monopoly on our health, on our well-being, on our safety, on our, yeah, fill in the blank, our education, our wisdom. So that was the beginning, and I met John McKnight around about 1993. So he would be one of the founding thinkers and framers of asset-based community development, along with Professor Jody Kretzmann. And their work really resonated for me. They had, in the late 80s, gone through about 20 cities in North America and spent a lot of time actually just talking with people in communities. And what people in communities were saying to them is that it doesn't just take a village to raise a child. It takes a village to do most anything that matters in life. And whether that's safety or, personal well-being or even prosperity. So The Connected Community was a book then during the lockdown or the various lockdowns in COVID in the between 20 and 2020 and 22. Myself and John McKnight co-authored this book, The Connected Community, which was an attempt both to, in a fairly, plain spoken way, talk about what we had discovered through our journey in community. So it was like a community lover's guide to the galaxy, in the sense that it's full of stories from all over the world, but also full of evidence that's kind of linking what we now know from the science to what we know from the stories to some practical things you can do if you really want to use your strengths in service of community well-being. And that's the link, I think, really that's key. We can have a strength finder and we can discover and use that to amass private wealth and private development or personal development. And that's okay insofar as it goes. But the story we're telling in this book is the story about how people are using their gifts and their strengths and their capabilities in service of other people, and how, what do you know, that actually makes them feel a heck of a lot better than just privately amassing their wealth, or digging a bunker in the ground to deal with the doomsday scenario that we're all being told that we're leaning into at the moment. So we're trying to navigate between those two extremes, the doomsday scenario, and I'm not saying it isn't coming, but it's got limits in terms of how mobilizing it is, and then the very individualistic story that says, look out for yourself. You're a rugged individual. Use your strengths to serve your ego. So somewhere in between those two extremes is the golden mean, and that's what we're trying to speak into and live into as well, I would say.
Fascinating. Now, I'm guessing that some of the listeners to the podcast have not heard about asset-based community development before. What's the short or long version,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever
Well,
version
yeah,
of
no,
it
it's
that
a
you'd
great
like to
question.
share?
My shorthand really is start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, and start local where you can. So it's this principle that says, now we have to be cautious here, of course. What I'm about to say is not a silver bullet or a panacea, but it's a way of thinking about, if I want to have a good life and I want, my loved ones to have a good life, what might be some of the entry points to that? And one of them might be to say, well, start where you are, look at what surrounds you. But I think where asset-based community development is useful is it sort of puts us in the way of a pair of glasses that help us see stuff that surrounds us with fresh perspective. So often, I think what I'm about to highlight and what I'm about to bring into focus is stuff that's so commonplace and so parochial almost, that I think we tend to either render it invisible or we devalue it. So let me list a few things that I think are really essential for a good life, and not just me personally, but the research and the various testimonies, if you like, we have from people around the world. So the first is that I think in every neighborhood, to one degree or another, there are probably other people aside from you or me, by definition. Unless we're homesteaders and we're far removed. Typically in neighborhoods or in villages, by definition, there are a group of interrelated people. Now we know that the statistics are telling us in the last even 10 years that they may be more likely atomized and disconnected than at any time previous in history. Notwithstanding, they're there. So part of what ABCD, asset-based community development, says is look again at your neighbors and recognize that even though they may be, strangers to you or you don't know them, they all have gifts. They all have things they know, things that they can make and do, things that they feel deeply about. And that if we could discover what those gifts are and we could be connected with them, we might be able to do things together that would be enhancing for us, for other neighbors, and for the more than human species and the place itself. So that's one idea. The other is that we've got clubs and groups and associations, and they're how neighbors group up with each other to do anything from, sing in a choir to go on a protest if they're not happy about something that's happening. And so I think a big part of what we're saying is those associations are absolutely critical for democracy. A lot of people have kind of been drawn into this idea that democracy is about speechifying or expressing your opinion either online or on land. But actually, a lot of these associations are doing things that are really consequential and actually pretty foundational to democracy, including watching out for each other, caring for our freedoms, and also figuring out how we can coexist and find ways of living beside people we don't agree with. So, and yet doing things together, even if that's just breathing the same air. So, in that sense, also, we really value the fact that we're sharing space. So there's the natural environment, the blue sky above us, the sea around us, all of that kind of stuff. So beginning to recognize that actually the scale of the neighborhood is a very important unit of change in society. So we think about changing the world, that's huge. Changing our city is even huge for a lot of people. But I think most people can get behind things that are close to their own doorstep. And, when we think about where people experience loneliness, they experience it somewhere. So I think those key pieces, that our neighbors have gifts, our associations matter, the place where we live is an important unit of change. And then the fact that we have local economies, we know, for example, if you can get your dollar to stay and circulate 3 times more in your local economy, that's good for jobs, that's good for well-being, that's good for sustainability. So all of these things, we live in a world that often tells us much of what needs to happen for real sustainable change to occur is it's contingent on some external force doing something to us or for us. And what ABCD is saying is, well, let's accept that as partially true. We don't want to argue about it because there's some truth to that. And let's also hold in tension the paradox that says, also, it is true to say that there are things that are within our hands. And when we build in solidarity with each other, not charity, but in solidarity with each other, we can do all kinds of consequential things. So, we wouldn't have the 8-hour working day without that solidarity. We wouldn't have weekends off without that solidarity. We wouldn't have universal suffrage without that solidarity. And I think increasingly, you look at places in the United States, including places that have been very, very distressed, like Flint, where you had a huge amount of tragedy related to lead poisoning. And these are things that were done to communities and where harm and neglect was visited on communities. And in a lot of ways, I think the reason that change is now coming to places like Flint is because community got organized. And they began to not alone demand change, but also demand the freedom to be the change that they're seeking. So this is, I think, a really interesting thing in relation to positive psychology and asset-based community development. So there's a really interesting theory at the intersection point between community development and positive psychology, I think personally, which is called mattering theory. Mattering from the word matter, I matter, you matter, we matter. So mattering theory. And one of the main proponents, there are lots of people who are associated with this theory, but one of the main proponents is a guy called Isaac Tensky. He's an Argentinian academic who's moved, I think, over the last few decades to the US and teaches. I'm not sure where he's teaching out of now, but in any case, he says a couple of really, really useful things which overlap a lot with our theories in ABCD. So the first thing he says is there can be no wellness without fairness. And I think that's absolutely right. So if you've got people who are living in neighborhoods where they're dying at 10 years, younger than people who are, a mile up the road then there's there's a reason for that, and that has a lot to do with policy and with injustice and health inequalities. But he also acknowledges, and this is where ABCD comes in, that you can't just change injustice or change the nature of society or the nature of somebody's outcomes by valuing them, by being person-centered. You've also got to do something that creates the conditions within which they can add value to the world. Now, the simple way of saying that is we need to shift the narrative from just seeing people as needy to helping them recognize they're needed. And this is where their strengths can come to the well-being of community. And it isn't just a fairness model is key. You need that, but you also need to recognize that fairness isn't just about servicing people or charity. It's about solidarity, and it's about saying to folks who maybe don't believe they have anything to offer, you have a valued social role. Your contribution is needed. And I think the combination of those two brings us into a very different way of thinking about helping, which is the subject of my current book that I'm working on. Can we reimagine helping? Because I think helping needs help, and it needs to change. So there we go. Well, you've got wonderful. So that book, I think, is a really important book because I think it sort of centerpieces our conversation today, and it really illustrates that interface point between the importance of community and the importance of honoring the individual contribution.
So, listeners, as Cormac was mentioning, this scholar on mattering theory, I tracked down his book, which was sitting behind me, Promoting Well-Being, Linking Personal, Organizational, and Community Change. And if all goes well, I will have Professor Prilotensky on the podcast within the next few weeks. So
Great.
it's there's a preview for everybody of what's to come there. So the literature on well-being for the individual, as far as books go, seems to number in the thousands. And the books at the intersection of well-being research and community seems to number at about two or so. Yours it is.
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
there's probably
Yeah,
more, but that's my perception of of that intersection.
that's probably not unfair. We could debate the numerics of it, but I think the proportionality is true. And I mean, it's interesting to wonder why, but I think research and research funding tends to reflect the consciousness of society, so we fund what, broadly speaking, we're interested in, and we research accordingly. And I think to a large extent, what's interesting is, we have so much significant now, I think, research around the dangers of loneliness, which is, let's be clear, a symptom of a problem rather than necessarily solely a problem in isolation. So, I think as we try to understand what individualism um, has brought about, I think it's clear, at least to my mind, that we tend to see an awful lot of the consequence of the breakdown of community very much in terms of lifestyle. And so an awful lot of the public health literature tends to bias towards lifestyle change or instrumental ways of addressing issues. But I think increasingly there's an acknowledgement that community cohesion is critical to mental well-being and to physical well-being. So, I think when we say loneliness is worse for your health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or obesity, Well, in the same way, we're not advocating there for, that you smoke and that you eat as much as you like, as long as you talk to people while you do it. Nor are we advocating that the solution is simply to refer people to activities, or to create an AI friend for everybody who's lonely. The solution is more fundamentally about how do we reorder our society so that we think about it much more as a social uh, cohesion challenge rather than an individual change journey. And this bias, I think, is something I want to call out. I know Isaac calls it out too, and a few others. So I think increasingly, particularly from a policy perspective, we really need to be very, very thoughtful about the issues are not about individual behavior change, I would say. So much of how, certainly my observation, I work in a lot of different countries, and much of what I see is there's sort of a bias in favor of one or two, and often both together, approaches to change. So one bias I've talked about, and that's the let's get everybody changing their behaviors, right? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying it is not a silver bullet. And if it's the only thing we're doing, or it's the main thing we're foregrounding as a change-making approach to policy, then it's not going to be sufficient. Maybe necessary, but not sufficient. The second one is reforming our institutions. So if we could just get better schools, our kids would have better outcomes. If we could just get more police responding quicker and being less violent, then we would have more race equity, we would have more peace, we would have more security and less crime. If our doctors could just figure out the cure to cancer, then everybody would live longer and so on and so forth. So that narrative, which call the institutional assumption, which by which I mean that we assume that for every human malady there is an institutional fix, and that those institutions and their agents, professionals, experts, which I love and I don't want to minimize or knock. We need them. I see myself as one of them. But we can't expect them to do our living, our dying, and the in-between bits for us. But what we do sometimes is we say, these institutions have a monopoly. I'm going to assume that my health is in the hands of a doctor, that my safety is in the hands of a police officer, that my child's education is in the hands of the education system. And in both instances, if that's the dominant assumptive, policy narrative, change individual behavior, reform our systems to get them better, we're going to disappoint and reduce the level of trust individual people have in their institutions, and we're going to burn our professionals out because they can't do it. It's just simply not possible to give them a monopoly and say, right, all of that stuff's your responsibility. And the same is true of politicians. When we outsource our political responsibilities to politicians, well, then we can see what we get. They reflect the consciousness of the people who vote them in or don't show up to the polls. And in the same way, I think a lot of what we're talking about here is this idea that we are interdependent, and actually we do have work to do at the political level, but it's not party political. It's not about ideology or opinion exchange, but it's about that work of what does it mean to be deeply civic, to be deeply civil, to be convivial, to work out problems together. What does that actually mean? And some of that means I've got to get over myself. And there are some things around my lifestyle that I'm currently engaged in, which are not necessarily good for 7 generations hence. And all of those things, they start to come into my consciousness. It doesn't mean that I'm going to wear a woolly jumper and live in a tree, but it does mean that somewhere in between extremes, I start to see myself in the South African expression Ubuntu, which we talk about in the book, which simply means I am because we are. So that sense of, in historical terms, because we're thinking a little bit about the US context here today, you go right back, one of the most important treaties, one of the most important books written about American democracy was written by Alexis de Tocqueville, ironically, a French count who came over to America at that very, very young, burgeoning stage of its evolution as a democracy in 1835, and spent a number of years observing what was it about American democracy that was distinctive. And his observation was that it was the associational life, that wherever in France an issue would be solved with an institutional intervention, in that young emerging democracy of America, what he noticed was it was people coming together. Now, I don't want to over romanticize that. There were lots of things that were being done which were deeply, deeply unjust and problematic. Notwithstanding, he was able to identify that this amalgam of people who often themselves left other countries and were pushed out and marginalized were able to kind of figure that together. If it wasn't going to be sorted out by a king or some kind of hero or, you know, idealistic savior, that it needed to be about us. And I kind of invoke that observation because I think it's one to remember, actually. And throughout democracy in America, which is a book I hear a lot of people reference, but I've actually met very few people who've actually read the book, which is interesting. It's well worth reading, in fact, because it's a mirror up to a nation about what it means to be united. And I think what it meant as I read the book to me was that actually we get connected at a very, very local level. If we're talking about building bonds of trust as opposed to just arguing about silly opinions or whatever, which come and go, but real, genuine bonds of trust, then we do that at quite a local level. Particularly, I mean, it's easy to do with people who vote like us and worship like us and think like us and look like us. But particularly if we want to build bonds that welcome the stranger at the edge, that's often about doing things at the very local level that get us beyond opinion and into something much more civic and much more immediate. So there's lots of theory now, and I'm sure you're well versed with it. But your own Surgeon General is talking a lot and invoking a lot of research around the different kinds of bonds we need. So you've got your classic kind of bonding social capital, which is largely your family, your friends, the people you know, the people you like. But then you've also got to have bridging social capital, and that's where you kind of connect outside your typical orbit, your typical circles, with people who will necessarily hold different views and have a diversity or a plurality of experiences, and then linking social capital. And linkage social capital is really about being able to link in with maybe folks who are politically influencing you. It could be your state legislator, it could be your local municipalities, etc. So it's becoming clear, and some of your listeners will be thinking about things like, how we deal as we lean into the next summer period with bushfires and all kinds of climate-related calamities. Emergency preparedness is becoming something that is uniting an awful lot of people who may think differently politically, but will share the same root of rock that will, need tending. And so I think that's bringing people together. Loneliness and isolation seems to be bringing people together. How we're going to age in our homes, in our places, well, is bringing people together. So there's I think, increasingly lots of different things that are offering us the opportunity to unite around something that is deeper than my opinion about what you ought to do for me.
Well said. Well said. With the positive psychology tradition, it seems to have a emphasis on the individual. And one of the theories that it seems like a lot of people are familiar with is the idea of self-actualization. And we picture Maslow and a hierarchy of needs. And I
Mhm.
hear that you have a little bit of a backstory on this that I would love to hear more about.
Yeah, well, I can't claim to own it. It's something that just caught my attention a number of years ago, and I've heard a number of people share this, and it's resonated strongly, including Sir Harry Burns, who was the the equivalent of your Surgeon General in Scotland many years ago, and Harry has done a huge amount of work. He's subsequently moved into a teaching position, but still continues to be a tremendous advocate in this space. And I think, he and others have just been reminding us that so many of these so-called enlightened or Enlightenment traditions actually are appropriated by First Peoples and First Nations indigenous wisdom, Indeed, a lot of the American ideas around representative democracy come from the Longhouse traditions, in terms of Six Nations and whatnot. But with respect to our esteemed forebear in this conversation, Abraham Maslow, whose own childhood was really instructive. I mean, I think his childhood is very illustrative of a lot of complexity and trauma and whatnot. But notwithstanding, he said two things which I thought were very compelling. One was his idea of the law of the hammer, which maybe your listeners are familiar with. But it's this idea that if the only tool you have available to you is a hammer, every problem will look like a nail. And I think that's a good summary of what we've been talking about in respect of the institutional assumption. If the only instrument for intervention you have is an institutional or professional programmatic one, all you'll see in every problem out there is some kind of an institutional challenge that requires a service. The other thing that he shares in his own story, and interestingly, in his original work around self-actualization, he didn't actually use a triangle. He didn't use the pyramid. That was imposed on his work laterally. But his original treatise didn't have that. Notwithstanding, in his 30s, he really wanted to study other traditions to try to understand, the emergence in the industrial context, the post-industrial context of lots and lots of hierarchies. So post the First World War, leaning into the Second World War, a lot of our institutions were becoming more and more hierarchical. So he really wanted to understand the emergence of that. And so he spent some time with Blackfoot communities, sort of straddling the US, Canada, kind of Rockies region, and just spending time with them, he learned quite a lot about the egalitarian nature of how they organize themselves as communities. And while coming from a context where he was seeing and saying self-actualization is a kind of an arduous personal journey that really only about 10% of an average population ascend to after, kind of almost the hero's journey sort of thing, but very much personal. But what he noticed was in the context that he was in was as he lived among those communities, he saw that actually the vast majority of people were self-actualized. And in the sense that from a very, very early age, they were born into a context where the culture called self-actualization forth from them. It said, you know, you have a gift, Nick, and this community needs your gift. And we have a set of rituals and a set of ways by which you will find that gift and you will come back and contribute that. So, from a very early age, you're born into a story that says you have something unique to contribute. Your community needs it. And we figured out ways that will enable that. Now, you can romanticize that. And there's a lot, you know, that wasn't so great and whatever about that, but that's everywhere you go. But what he came to observe was that it was an inversion, actually, in a sense, it was the opposite of the pyramid, that the vast majority of people in that context came into a culture where the way of being together meant that people were actually of of a story. They were storied into this idea that we need you. We cannot be community without you. And I think we, by contrast, often in more individualized contexts, we come into a different story. And it's a story about private wealth, and it's a story about personal development, and it's a story about leaving the community to make your own way. So we talk to our kids about, you know, going out into the big bad world, making your way in the world, the rugged individual, you know, the iPhone, um, finding myself, consuming as a way of being well. And then we know, of course, Eric Hoffer's great thing, you know, you can never get enough of what you don't really want. And so, in a sense, the self-actualization piece is about detoxifying ourselves of that story and almost in spite of our cultural story, getting to self-actualization. So it almost becomes about kind of running interference and avoiding the dominant narrative, whereas his experience of First Peoples at that time was that, in fact, they had figured out a way that that story is a story that is encultured, and that the culturing of that story meant people were actually finding a good life from the outset.
Fascinating. As you're talking, you're helping me to think a little bit more deeply about an idea that I have percolating that I wonder if I might run this by you.
Sure, please do.
Okay. So in one way, you might call it a uh, mattering maker machine or something along those lines. But the idea that I had comes from several pieces. One, just the sort of the strengths finder. So for myself, it was something of a transformative experience, and in part, I think I've recently gotten a diagnosis for ADHD, and one of the typical occurrences for someone with that is to have a very sort of ruminating brain, I guess you could say, that when you need a focus, it sort of tempts you just into the mind wandering, backwards, forwards, every which way. But it the tendency is towards sort of reflection on your past mistakes, which tends to be something fairly typical for someone with ADHD to have. And then this ruminator sort of doubles down and sort of generally kind of forces you to rethink all that negative experience. Um, and that was, I found, very much the case for myself when I look back at my past. And so the strengths finder sort of put a chink in this sort of mindset that I had that was extremely self-critical, and sort of that translated, I think, into sort of like a cynical outlook outside of myself. that's sort of you know, one thing that sort of makes me interested in the Strengths Finder in case there's someone else
Mm,
out there that might be having that kind of experience.
mm,
One of the positive psychology interventions that I'd seen was looking at volunteerism as a way to elevate positive mental well-being. The figure that I heard was somewhere between an hour to three a week for like a work, an adult working full time to still, try to add an hour to three of volunteerism, formal or informal or what have you. And then another thing that I didn't had no idea, but for someone with ADHD, it's 2 to 3 times more likely to have substance abuse issues. So for myself, that was alcohol. So I've been in a 12-step recovery program and just seen the sort of the dynamics of wonderful dynamics of sort of a nudge towards being of service, meeting regularly with other other persons that are in that journey of uh really from self to we
yes,
kind of is the
yes.
gist of it. And so I was kind of trying to picture a way to make a version of it where the emphasis might be on, for the purpose of building positive mental well-being, like let's look at our strengths as a starting point. Um, put those into like set of values for yourself. Maybe some of those words from a strengths finder really resonate with you. Maybe not. Flesh that out for like your core values and strengths and come into a sense of awareness about that. Use that as a lens to think about the volunteerism that you might be able to do in your community, and then meet regularly, maybe weekly, to talk about your experience around these things. And so it's my goal in that really is to sort of build up people from from the inside out and the outside in
Mm,
by getting people connected into community in various ways that speak to them. So I feel like I'm trying to get at some of those dynamics
mm,
that
mm.
that you were
Yeah, it sounds
talking
like
about
it.
earlier. So
Yeah.
um
I
yeah, if you have
yeah,
reflections on any
yeah.
of that already, please.
I do. I think the first thing is just to say I really appreciate you sharing that because I think that that ability to be open and honest about your own experiences is so powerful. You know, even just in terms of modeling that and freeing people up. I can imagine people are listening and going, "Okay, that really resonates. That really permits me to be who I am." And I think that's massive. That ability to be with other people and to be authentic. Not to be sharing with the intention of getting something from somebody, but just to be in somebody's company and to be who you are is really, really powerful. And I think what's refreshing about that is it's not a technique. So often I think what people are quite tired of in their lives is that, idea of somebody coming at them with something in mind for them and a technique that is being used in order to fix them because they're broken. So I think one of the things that's really important is to say, look, whatever we do when we're in friendship, we're in relationship, we personally get into solidarity with each other, is that it's not about saying the other person is broken or the other person is damaged or the other person is deficient. We're saying that the human condition and with all of its extremes, the human condition by its nature is fascinating, and slotting people into categories is never a good idea, or at least it's got very limited utility from what we know and from experience. So I think the whole idea of saying I'm going to go on a journey of sobriety because I feel that I want to find other ways to engage with my nature, other than using alcohol or whatever it might be, and I'm going to do that with other people who say, let's do it together. Let's do it as a community. I think that's incredibly powerful modeling as well. It's actually saying, look, in fact, if you think about it, like there's some really great examples in the world of where people have just gotten together and said, how about we do this together and help each other out? I think the 12-step movement, a lot of people will be negative and cynical about these movements, but on balance, it has done an incredible amount and continues to do an incredible amount. And you could call it a mutual aid or self-help group, but it does have a massive amount of good contribution of the world. Another example of this would be the breastfeeding movement. The La Leche League International, for example, started with 7 women in Chicago in the 50s and is now in 89 countries around the world. These are self-led movements, women-led, people journeying towards sobriety, and with all of their faults and all of their limitations by comparison with, medical intervention and whatnot, they are good faith attempts on the parts of regular people to do what you just said earlier on. I thought you summed it up so beautifully when you said it's a shift from me to we. It's a shift from you're not broken, you're not isolated, you're not beyond redemption. You are part of a community of people who are human, who misstep, who by their very nature struggle, who suffer. That's the human condition. Welcome, you're in. If you breathe, you're in. And your expression and manifestation of that is you. Now let's see what happens next. So I think that piece is, so beautiful because it says, say, to a member of a breastfeeding group who's struggling to breastfeed their child, you're not broken, you're not deficient, there's not something wrong with you. But let us kind of form a support around you, and we'll figure it out. Now, I think in that context, then the idea of having conversations, which zeroes in a little bit on the specifics of what I think you were sharing. I think to say that we're going to have conversations that foreground the notion that people, regardless of what story they have in their head about themselves that brought them to the group, that we're going to foreground their capability to be sober, to breastfeed, to contribute to the well-being, to make amends, whatever the language is. It is, what's lovely about this is that it's so diverse. So you go into different associations and they'll have different ways, and some I don't want to be part of. So I don't want to over romanticize these circles either, because some of these circles are quite hateful and they're about keeping certain people in and certain other people out. But some of them are places of great healing and well-being, and you've got to proceed with your hazard lights on in these places. So I think being able to hold the integrity of who you are is important as well. And when you're in personal conversations, being able to say to people, what are your strengths? What are your gifts? What are your passions? What do you care about enough to actually take action on? I think those conversations really matter. And I personally feel any way that you can kind of do that is going to be a powerful, powerful invocation almost to a better life. So we talk a lot about having community connectors. So it's interesting in every neighborhood, in every workplace, I'd say probably, truth be told, in every context where you have lots of people, you're going to have certain people who are great at leading, but you're also going to have certain people who are great at connecting. They may not necessarily be great leaders. Sometimes they are, but they may not identify in those terms, but they're wonderful at connecting people, at building trust. And that's their joy. Their joy isn't problem solving or getting people to follow them, but they just really like bringing people together. And they're quite happy to step back. They don't need to take the credit. They don't need to hang around and be a spare tire or, be a gooseberry. They just, wow, like these guys, they really get on well together. I just take joy out of knowing that I put these two folks in conversation with each other. And I can't wait to hear what happens, but I may not, and that's okay too. So I think that conversations and the power of questions are really great ways of making those opportunities more likely. My sense of it is that you're possibly a connector and that your impulse is to be intentional about the way you frame questions. So I take a kind of a light touch or a kind of a loose view to all of these different mechanisms like Strength Finder and whatever. And I kind of think what they are useful for is they're great prompters to help us to lift off our labels and to see our gifts. And they can be great ways of making visible the invisible. But I think that's what your idea would do as well.
Thanks for engaging in a little bit of reflection about that. I'm
Thank you
picturing,
for trusting me.
yeah, I'm picturing several places where it might fit into my own local community. One of the companies here has a policy of giving employees 8 hours a month of paid leave to volunteer.
Great.
Another application that I've been looking at is, well, a little bit of history. In the 70s, the Industrial Areas Foundation did some work in Lincoln and helped. I think there were some neighborhood associations already in place, but they helped kind of flesh out and get neighborhood associations going all across the town. And they've kind of, some have continued ever since, and some kind of emerge and disappear and reemerge. And I'm picturing, I'm so this project, I've come up with several names for it, like the generativity generator, the community builder, the difference maker generator. So, it's the
Great.
idea, I think,
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
main
Yeah.
thing. But
Yeah.
I'm picturing doing one for trying to get one of these things going in an area that sort of integrates three neighborhoods around a high school, and have sort of the light suggestion be to point your difference making back to your neighborhood to hopefully for some people through their volunteer efforts they'll find themselves
Mm.
drawn towards the community building kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
difference making.
That's great.
So
There's a reservoir of contributions and gifts that are largely languishing in our neighborhoods because we don't tend to organize our neighborhoods in this way. We often organize our workplaces, be it through trade unions or assembly lines or productivity or whatever it might be. But neighborhoods are often the places that we're going in and out of, and we may as well be on a tour bus with the curtains pulled across, drawn across. So the idea that you would reanimate and remember in a sense, like I think that word remember is quite useful because it's a double meaning to both recall and also to remember, as in the sense of become a member again, rejoin. And I think maybe there's a real opportunity here to think about our neighborhoods consciously, but that's not going to just happen. So I think your point is well made that that needs animation. So in my language, and this is where I see, I guess, Nebraska is a really interesting example because I think one of the things of great innovation and great importance that's happening in Nebraska is the Nebraska Community Foundation. And the CEO there, Jeff Yost, has really begun to think about what is it that would help, if you like, small towns get organized, and particularly in contexts where maybe their biggest export is their young people. And where when you think past 250 or you think to a 3-degree neighborhood scenario by 2080, so even this idea, this debate around net zero being at 1.5 degrees, well, we're now hearing credible voices saying actually that might be a little naive based on what we're seeing. And without being a fearmonger about that, it's sort of interesting to see that what the Nebraska Community Foundation are doing is that they're leaning into positivity and they're leaning into what do people want to do to reanimate the economy, to reanimate the possibility that if they've got three kids, that at least one, two, maybe even three can grow up imagining that they'll have enough money to buy a home in their local township if they want to, and maybe start a business or whatever it might be. That doesn't just happen. That must be animated, and that's about imagination. That's about, from a very, very young age, giving people the opportunity to recognize that their contributions really matter. The only thought that I have that maybe of some utility here is, setting aside the example of the Nebraska Community Foundation, uh, where money is part, they help towns build endowments, and those endowments in turn can invest in really great ideas for the community building piece. I would say that volunteering, which we tend to use a kind of a catch-all term for anything that involves people showing up in, the square, in the common square, in the public square. I wonder whether some people resonate with that term, right? It has salience. So it's like, if it was a duck call, that species of duck would just come out and go, I'm here, I'm ready, I want to volunteer. But there's a lot of other species of duck out there who are really turned off by that, because for them, it means they're going to be sentenced to volunteering and meetings for the rest of their life. So I think some of what we got to try to do as we figure out how are we going to invite very diverse, very plural, very different contributions, we're going to have to expand our repertoire of duck calls and kind of get beyond the town hall, get beyond the meeting, get beyond the committee and the formality of what might have seemed to have a lot of salience in the 70s and maybe in the 80s. I'm not so convinced 20, 30, 40 years on that is, it's not kind of cultivating the bonds that really are the ties that bind. And what I like about your ideas, I think what you're leaning into is the personal that becomes social, but not necessarily bureaucratic. It's about something that animates us to do good in the world. And it could be really local. It could be, get to know three people and hang out once a week and repair things. And it could be something really, really significant. But that's up to them. It's not something you're supporting but not directing. And I think that's very refreshing. But maybe you need a broader catch-all than just volunteering if you're going to reach a broader base of people.
Yeah, yeah. I just that phrase difference making. There's a little bit of history behind that phrase going back to the 50s with the mentoring program that was developed by some of the education psychology professors, where they put I guess you could say, sort of the young persons that were already kind of shining in terms of, like, high social intelligence, general intelligence, and very cordial to their peers, and sort of have sort of an uplifting spirit. They put these young persons in relationship with similarly expressive college students, and I believe they use that phrase difference making there. And one of the findings, this mentoring program's been going on for, I believe it's coming up on 75 years here.
Uh-huh.
But what they found was, on the part of the mentors, that this cultivation of generativity within them led to a greater sense of social responsibility. And the person that you mentioned, Jeff Yost, I believe he
Mm.
was a mentor in that.
Ah.
So he kind of himself embodies that research
Mm.
finding of
That's
becoming
wonderful.
highly socially responsible.
Wow, absolutely. Yeah,
So
that's a
that
great connection. I didn't know that. Wow, isn't that just wonderful? The intersectionality between these different ways of viewing possibility in the world. That's great. And of course, Jeff is such a exemplar, I think, of what we mean by citizenship, as being the recognition that we are interdependent, and we get well in light of others getting well as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of the other dynamic that I was picturing within this project that I'm envisioning, is that it has some of that possibility for people who've walked through that process of thinking through their values and aligning it, aligning their difference making accordingly, and doing it and getting involved in conversation about that, that they're then able to, help the young person that maybe hasn't gone through that yet to sort of share their experience with that, and to sort of have that sort of internal generativity baked into the project. The
That's great.
the vision quest, the hero's journey
Mm.
prompter kind of is what I'm
Yes,
picturing
yeah,
there a little bit.
absolutely. I think one of the things that's it's wonderful. I think one of the things that would be interesting to talk a little bit more about at some other point in time would be then as you think about all of those individual possibilities, but in the context of a neighborhood, one of the things that would emerge or become manifest, I think, would be more associational life. So that, more as the me's become the we's, but in the context of a local place. And it can spill out, of course. But you could imagine having, say, a community animator in a neighborhood who is finding these connectors, who in turn is having those kinds of conversations with individuals and associations, of course, as well. It doesn't have to be just one on one. And you could imagine that neighborhoods, villages, places like Lincoln, wherever, could begin to organize, right? Just, I mean, if you go back, like you say, historically, the IAF attempt was around organizing in Nebraska. So that idea is saying, well, we have figured out how to organize in lots of different contexts. So, around universal suffrage, particularly the women's movement. And there are other identity-based ways of organizing, which have been really consequential and really important in terms of racial equity. And we have some really great examples of organizing around trade unions and civil society and philanthropy and whatnot. And that idea of the neighborhood as being a unit within which we could also get organized, not new. It's been tried, it's been tested. We know it's of consequence. But often when we organize at that level, we're organizing to change something externally, right? So I really want to honor the word you used, generative, because I think we can also we think about individuals as organisms, right? We think we can even, it's interesting, conceptually, we can think of a forest as an organism, but for some reason we struggle as human beings to think about a neighborhood as an organism. And I think it's a lot to do with, your home is your castle, and, high fences makes good neighbors and all that kind of narrative. But if we think about our villages or townships, our neighborhoods as organisms, that they can be generative as well as the individuals. So this is not a cluster of disaggregated individuals that one by one by one by one by one we're going to mentor, cross our fingers, and hopefully a subset of them will do good and will make good. That what we're talking about is we're talking about this idea that if you do enough of this intentionally and regular, you're showing up regularly. It's not just we try it, we parachute in a program and we disappear after a year, but we're prepared to actually be alongside people for the long haul. There's an investment and a presence there. What I have seen in my life, and it's been my great privilege to see this, to experience this, and to be part of this, is that places heal. Places that have gone through very significant traumas become more powerful. And that power, that agency, lead to these places becoming safer, becoming more prosperous, becoming more powerful, and indeed holding, where necessary, external forces to account. But what's really struck me is that isn't just what they're doing. They're not just saying, well, we build our power in order to hold external forces to account. They're also saying our power is for us. It's for us to create, to have joy, to deal with suffering, to fix problems, and to create possibilities. And I think that's really important because that's something more than just traditional anger organizing, where we're trying to make, the man give us a place at the seat of the table and it's their boardroom table. And I think one of the things that different way of thinking about organizing community building says is communities are generative. They're not just reactive. They're not just victims on their knees waiting for the man to give them a seat at the table, but they are absolutely essential for a functioning democracy, for well-being in society, and for a prosperity that's fair to all. And that's key. It doesn't mean that they can solve all problems. I don't want to romanticize this. This is complex. We know this. But if we were to do a maniacal experiment and we were to take all of that associational life out of our neighborhoods and try to top down parachute well-being or prosperity or democracy as though it's some kind of a product that we can just funnel down a chute and people kind of swallow wholesale, then I think we would see the rise of authoritarianism. We would see the weakening of civil society, and we'd see a mindless, almost robotics in our politics, um, which is the opposite of what we're talking about. So wherever people can find associational life, whether it's in the 12-step movement, their neighborhoods, their breastfeeding groups, their aging well clubs, and where they can actually also talk to each other. This is the great insight, I think, about the neighborhood is in every neighborhood, you probably have people who are in a 12-step group. You probably have people who are in a breastfeeding group or were at one point in their life. You probably have people who were, young once and had vibrant contributions, but now as they age and mobility isn't quite what it was, are feeling isolated in their homes. You have the microcosm of the world on your doorstep. And what you're describing, I think, is what I would want to invite folks who are listening to consider as well, that maybe you should try to get to know three of your neighbors before you need them, because you will need them. It's just a matter of time.
Agree 100%. Now, at the start, you mentioned that you've already got something cooking for your next book. Helping, I believe may have been part
Yes.
of how you put that. Are there any sort of preliminary insights for your what's next that you might like to
What's
talk
next?
about
Yeah.
along those lines, or anything
Yeah,
else that's
I think that would be
coming
good to
up?
explore. Yeah, so the working title is How to Help Without Harming. And what I'm really trying to suggest is that I think a lot of the way that we've conceived various forms of helping have become very instrumentalized. So there's a couple of different points that I want to make. First of all, the very simple, bold statement, really, that helping can harm. And I think for some people that's a quite shocking statement, but it's, so I back that up with a lot of practical examples. And I think policing is a good one, actually. Where police use excessive force and paramilitarize peacemaking into something other than that. That's an example of where the state can do harm. And I think particularly in your country, there's lots of examples of that. Prison so many of our prisons are now academies of crime. We know that a lot of our hospitals are the one place you don't want your aging relatives to go to for a very long period of time. Just want them to go in, get patched up, and get back to normality as quickly as possible. Why? because they're places that are disabling after a certain period of time. You forget how to walk. If you've got cognitive impairments, it becomes an accelerant to those. So in all kinds of ways, our institutional attempts at helping, they're limited. They work insofar as they work, but past a certain intensity, they give you the opposite of what they intend. This, not a new idea. Ivan Illich was the great articulator of this in the 70s. But I update that research. Now, I don't want to be a kind of a harbinger of doom here. So I'm not saying, and therefore, what we should do is get rid of our institutions. Not at all. Actually, what I then explore is a way that in public service, which I absolutely believe in, and I've dedicated my life to, and I know you have as well, Nick. So, in service to community, in service to people, how can those who want to help without harming? And so the whole core of the book is the basic thesis is cultivate a set of practices which are grounded on the principle of integrity, but also a pedagogy. So if I'm going to help, I need to know how to do that in a way that supports without directing, in a way that foregrounds people's capabilities while backgrounding labels that diminish people or characterize them as damaged or broken. I need to have the courage to occupy the gap between the excesses of my institutional bureaucracy at times and maybe the tentative nature of some of the communities that I'm working with that may not have the confidence initially to step up. But part of my work is to create space for that to happen. So what I'm really journeying with here is an affirmative statement around help as something that is a powerful force for good in the world, that does warrant people having, salaried roles. And having said that, what I want to really bring back is this idea of helping as a personal act of solidarity rather than as a technical exhibition of expertise. So really challenging that one up, one down relationship and really thinking about that companionship, that alongside role, and how we can bring in, whether we're a doctor or a nurse or a police officer, we can bring in the question of how can I be a civic doctor rather than accenting or foregrounding our specialism. Experts we need, but ultimately a civic expert, somebody who's actually really saying, I want to enable you to have a good day and have a good life. And my expertise is in service of that, rather than you're a carcass that happens to carry the enemy called cancer, and I'm going to kill that no matter what it takes me. And, your death is my failure. That kind of very dangerous pathogenic narrative needs to be replaced with a salutogenic narrative, with a strength-based narrative, with an asset-based narrative, and with a human and beyond human-centered narrative that says, my liberation is intertwined with yours. So that's what the book is about, rather than what I think previous challenges to the helping professions has been about, which is basically pathologizing them and saying, look, get out of the way. I am not for that. I think that in basic terms, the book says there are things we can do in our communities if barriers are removed. There are things that we can do with some help if the help is strength-based and the help is positivity-centered and human-centered and beyond human-centered. So there's that kind of sense of generative help. And then there are things that we actually do need our institutions to do, and we need our institutions to be strong. A basic argument is I think we're stuck on the third. We're stuck on our, assuming our institutions can do all these things for us, and at the very same time, distrusting our communities more than ever in the history of the human story. So at the very time we distrust our institutions most, we are demanding most from them. Is it any wonder we're struggling to recruit people to our professions, that we're struggling to keep people in our rural areas in terms of running doctors, surgeries, and whatnot? This is all intertwined. And I suppose the other final piece I'd say is I'm arguing that we cannot have helping professions that help unless we have active citizens. that show up as well. That actually there's work for us to do too. And outsourcing our life and our well-being and our democracy to helpers and exonerating ourselves of being part of that story means we're going to get some pretty awful outcomes. And we can change that. We can, we can do something about that. There is incredible reason for hope, but there's also a lot of hard work to be done. So that's what the book is notionally about. Now I've got to write the actual book, so there's that, but I think that's the vision for it.
That's a beautiful vision. Well, thank you so much for creating the tools that you have created already and staying on that trajectory. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Nick.
Cormac, for being a guest on the podcast here today. If people wanted to learn more about your work, where would you direct them?
There's a lot of free material online, so I suppose that's always the first place to go. So that's just a matter of searching my name, CORMAC for Russell, or USSELL. You'll get quite a lot of TED Talk videos, quite a lot of resource material. If people want to spend a modest amount, the book, The Connected Community, is a really neat guide, I think, for anybody who either in their own neighborhood wants to build connections, or indeed if you're a practitioner and you want to think about how you can help people in neighborhoods get organized and build community. That's there. The other book that I've written, which a lot of people use at policy level and more philosophically, is called Rekindling Democracy, a professional guide to working in citizen space. It really is speaking directly to policymakers, to politicians, to leaders, practitioners, professionals about how to reimagine the role that you have in service of people. So it's a kind of a forerunner to the book I'm working on at the moment. So that's there as well. We do a lot of training and a lot of getting alongside folks in the US and in 38 other countries around the world as well. So lots of blogs sharing those stories and whatnot. So I'd start there with the book and with the stuff online. And I also quite active on social media. So you can follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, and on LinkedIn. And always happy to interact and hear your stories and share some of my own. So I'm quite a social being. So you'll find me very happy to engage in conversation with you if you'd like to reach out.
The Connected Connector.
Try to live it rather than just talk about it. That's my motto.
Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.